Good morning, everybody. Good morning as well. For those of you that don't know, we're broadcasting this live to all of our fire stations. So those that are not already on emergency calls, they'll be watching this, and then of course we record that for later playback. But I want to welcome all of you here this morning. This is the third presentation that Alex has made, and I would like to introduce Alex Maranghides, who is from NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, and he and his team. So I want to thank Bob and Joe for the time that you guys have spent, as well as Derek, who's not here, and Carrie was supposed to be here but hasn't got here yet, Carrie Leland. But and some of you know her as a CSFD family member. But they have spent 3 years after the Waldo fire. I remember talking with Alex right after the fire occurred, begging him to come out here. And he and his team and NIST were gracious enough to dedicate an awful lot of money and time to come out here and analyze the events of this tragic fire. And you will find through the presentation today that they have discovered landmark research and themes that he's going to discuss, that is basically enabling us to begin making a very significant paradigm shift, which we must do if we're going to deal with the WUI fire problem. So, again, we've got a lot of media here. I want to welcome you. The restrooms, by the way, you can go through these doors, and obviously there's an exit door there. For the group that we have, the restrooms are around to the right. Just keep curving around the right side. They're on the other side of the building, men's and women's. Alex will do a presentation, and then at the end of that he will take questions. I want to welcome all of the external fire departments, basically our cooperators and partners. Thank you for taking the time to come here. The information is going to be very important. And I want to thank, because most of you participated through mutual aid in assisting us in that event, and a lot of you have provided information to NIST as part of this research. So we, as the City of Colorado Springs and the fire department, obviously cannot extend enough thanks to your support and help during that event. So without further ado, Alex, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Fire Marshal Lacey.
One point of business, Chief Dalton's going to smack me. So for those on the line, you have an opportunity to provide questions as well as the audience here. Chief Dalton's cell phone will be the avenue by which you can text in questions, and we will announce those, and then Alex will answer those. Chief Dalton's cell phone number is 491-0654. 491-0654. And again, that's where you can text your questions at the end of Alex's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Welcome all. I want to spend the next hour talking with you about the Waldo fire, the investigation we did. And specifically, we're going to be talking primarily about the Mountain Shadows community that was affected. We're not going to look at the entire Waldo fire. But before we get into the details, I want to say a couple of things. This study would not have been possible without the input from all the first responders that spent time with us. We had over 220 technical discussions with first responders, and that's really where the bulk of our data came from, together with images from Steve Schoper and some other sources. So your input really enabled this work, and we really are grateful for the time you spend with us on this. A couple of logistical issues to cover, and then we'll get into the really nitty-gritty of the report, all the exciting stuff. If you were mutual aid, then responded in the Waldo in Mountain Shadows, and you or a member of your fire department had interactions with us in terms of technical discussions, on your way out, please see Bob or Joe. We have some material for you to pick up. We also have CDs over there for anyone who wants a copy of the report electronically, and also an abbreviated version of today's presentation. So, let's talk about the objectives of our research effort. This is the third case study or investigation that we have done in the wildland urban interface, and I'm specifically saying interface, not intermix. The first one was in California at the Witch Fire. Then we did the Tanglewood Complex Fire in Amarillo, Texas. and now the Waldo. This is by far the most comprehensive and most detailed because of the quality and quantity of the data that we received. So one of the key components that we wanted to capture here, which is absolutely essential, and you're going to hear me say this several times, is we needed to reconstruct the event timeline. Without the event timeline, you can draw very wrong conclusions if you just drive through the neighborhood after the fire. You really have to understand how the fire behaved in space and in time, together with the contributions from you, from the first responders. So these three things all come together to help us understand what really happened. So timeline number one, defensive actions in space and time. Number two, we ended up with over 4,500 different, distinct fire observations and defensive actions. And we spent over a year, essentially, cross-correlating all this data. And that's really where all the strength of this report comes from. So that when we had a first responder tell us, yeah, we put out that deck on fire, we have confirmation that that deck was ignited. And in many cases, we actually have pictures of the event taking place. So most of the data is cross-correlated, and it's really quite an amazing data set. There is some data that we're not able to cross-correlate, but that does not change the picture. We have so much information here. It's really unprecedented. That enables us to understand the evolution of the event in space and in time. I'll keep saying that. There were wind shifts that we're able to pick up that changed the fire behavior and how the fire ran. Instead of going west, went south. All your defensive actions, all that we're able to really piece together. And there's some really important lessons we feel from this. So the last thing is really just that, the lessons learned in terms of mitigation and in terms of first responder actions, tactics, and all of that. There are 6 investigation findings that I want to focus on. The report, which I have a copy behind me and is available in the CDs, is quite extensive, at over 200 pages. And there's a lot more in here than I can present in an hour. So I encourage you, if you have the time, to spend the 30 or 40 hours it's going to take to really read through it. If you only have 30 minutes, read the executive summary. And the numbers that I'm going to be showing today may be a little off. The real numbers are in the report. I have rounded the numbers here to make the presentation flow a little bit better. So the 6 items we're going to be covering today are, number one, WUI fires are different. They're not wildland fires and they're not urban fires. And that's really, in some ways, a simple statement, but in other ways, a very, very far-reaching and complex statement. And you're going to see why. We're going to talk about that throughout the presentation. These are different events and they need to be handled differently. The first responder defensive actions are very effective, and we have statistics to show how well you all did. And that's really impressive, as you'll see. Cascading ignitions, what we saw was that the wildland fire that came in the community did not destroy 450 homes or destroy 350 and ignited another and damaged another 100. Only a small fraction of structures were initially ignited by the wildlands. That's a very important message that can impact how you think about responding to future events. And following that train of thought, we identified that really pre-planning is going to be essential for these types of events, these WUI events, which, as I said earlier, are different. And a bigger issue in that context is that we don't have any national standards for how to do this. There are knowledgeable people, there are ideas, there are bits and pieces, but we don't have a framework for responding to WUI fires the same way we have methodologies and tactics for responding to, let's say, urban fires, or, for that matter, wildland fires. Defensible space concepts, we have looked at the performance of some of the structures. A lot is in the report. We have identified 2 or 3 limitations that I think are important for me to share with you here today. And lastly, I want to discuss why this type of a report is completely different from a rapid damage assessment, which is typically done after the fire, and provide some ideas about how we can optimize time, what makes more sense to do right after the fire and what makes more sense to do as part of a long-term, multi-year investigation. So a little bit of background here. I'm sure all of you know this, but just to put it in perspective, the fire comes in. It essentially glances the Cedar Heights community, and by glances I don't mean that there wasn't significant fire activity. I don't mean that there weren't extensive defensive actions, but the combination of defensive actions, vegetative fuel treatments that had taken place there before the fire, the wind, and the topography essentially resulted in no direct exposure to any of the structures over there. The fire then proceeded to the northeast and then hit the Mountain Shadows community where 344 homes were destroyed, most of which took place in less than 6 hours. And that's what we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so talking about. The fire then proceeded north the next day, and there was a flare-up at the Peregrine subdivision, and that was really a great success story. The flare-up was substantial. There was significant fire activity in terms of flame heights and fire intensity. However, the exposure there, that fire front was significantly smaller than what hit Mountain Shadows the day before. Having said that, I think it is still valid to look at Peregrine, and we have an appendix in our report for Peregrine, and we have an appendix for Cedar Heights. Peregrine is very interesting because there was exposure. Less than a handful of structures were ignited, nothing was destroyed, all the structures were saved. Tremendous pre-planning and significant resources available made this possible. So that's really a great story. I mentioned that only a limited number of structures ignited from the wildland fire front, and in the first hour, we identified 48. There is some uncertainty. There could be a few more, but that's the order of magnitude we're talking about. Those 48 quickly turned into 100 structures burning. There was a lot of structure to structure, and that has been one of the big findings here. There were vegetative ignitions later on as well, and there is more detail in the report. The pictures that you see here are some of the pictures that we have. These are courtesy of Steve Schoper, and they were essential in helping us piece together some of the timeline information. This is the Courtney area that we're going to talk more about in a few minutes. The early ignitions overwhelmed the resources, which is not unexpected for these large types of events. But what we're here to show is how effective the defensive actions were, and also look at the big picture in terms of look at the response look at the deployment of resources and the response to these types of events. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any national standards and national SOPs, and that's very important because you can look at the two extremes. Urban, we have 100+ years of extensive knowledge on how to respond to building fires. On the wildland side, same thing. In this environment, in the wildland-urban interface, we don't have that corporate, national, long-term history, and that is really critical, we feel, in moving forward. We need to start thinking about a national framework for addressing these types of events, because you'll see they're very, very different. They're complex, they're multi-jurisdictional, which has huge implications. Time is of the essence in a way that more closely resembles the time sensitivity associated with structural fires and less with wildland. So we're going to go through some of that. But I do want to stress that there's no right way to do this at this point, because we don't have a national standard. So what really happened, this is the Mountain Shadows area. This is the water tower around Wilson Road. First responders, a lot of you were in this area right here by Scepter Way when the helicopter waved to you to evacuate, because the conditions were becoming very dangerous as the front came down the hill. The fire front was several hundreds of feet wide and very intense. And it was actually even wider than that because it followed different drainages down. But we're going to focus on this part right here that went from north of the water tower down to and including the Flying W Ranch. So as the front hit and the plume changed its behavior, we're not going to here try to quantify whether it was plume lean or plume collapse because the plume was heavy, because of the downwind, because of the downdraft. The plume came down, and this part of the community, the visibility was lost to under 10 feet. Many reports we have from you were that when you were in a truck, you couldn't see the edge of the hood. People were using GPS to navigate out of the community. There were some residents also still in there. So it created a very, very difficult and dangerous environment. The plume wasn't contained and limited to this orange area, and this is just for illustration purposes. It extended further out almost all the way to Flying W. But once we moved away from roughly this area, it cleared up, and it was definitely smoky, but you could see to come down here and out. That was the initial event. In a couple of slides, I'm going to be showing you images from 2 video clips. One taken at Wilson Road, exactly 1 hour after the fire hit. And then the other taken on Majestic, the lower Majestic, about 5.5 hours later. All right, so let's look at how quickly things happened. The whole event, in terms of structure ignitions, when I say the whole event, I'm saying 95+% of it was over in 5.5 hours. So we went from 100 structures involved in an hour to 450 structures involved 5.5 hours later. And the message here is we were losing structures being destroyed at a rate of 1 a minute. That is happening. All of that happened very, very quickly. And the message is, if you have to do your planning in real time, you don't have time. You need to do as much of the planning ahead of time. The same way you have a plan if you respond to a box store fire, where you know where your water is, how many pieces of apparatus you're going to use, where you're going to stage, where your hazards are. That same type of approach we want to implement in the wildland urban interface. Again, I'll stress it, we don't have a standardized national way to develop such plans, but one of the purposes of this report, we feel, is to get this discussion going and get people to start thinking about how to design these types of plans. So the initial ignitions contributed in a very significant way to spread the fire, and we saw a lot of structure to structure, both in lower structure density areas and in higher structure density areas like Majestic and Courtney. So now we're going to look at apparatus response. And before we look at the details of this graph, I want to put it in perspective. In Colorado Springs, the goal is for urban fires to have a response nominally 7 to 9 minutes, which is a great response time, and it's equivalent or commensurate with what we see in many other cities in the US. So it puts one side, bounds the problem from the urban side. So a few things on the graph. The red line represents net apparatus. So there were over 100 apparatus that ended up getting into the Mountain Shadows community for the first 9 or 10 hours. The blue line is the net apparatus. Many apparatus went in and then went back out. They followed the fire north, or they ended up doing something else. They ended up having problems, or going and addressing some other issue in some other part of the fire. So the net is the blue. That was Those are the rigs and apparatus that were in there. There are a few things I want to point out, starting from the left. This is when the fire front hit, and the fact that the blue line goes almost to zero is because there was the first evacuation of first responders, with the helicopter providing the critical information to egress. Right about 3 hours into the event, we had a significant wind shift. The wind went from the west, started coming, instead of the west, started coming from the north. That changed the way the fire started running. And it also abated. There were some even more detailed wind fluctuations that we're able to pick up and are detailed in the report. And just for reference, you can see when the last mutual aid task force arrived in Mountain Shadows, which is about 1 o'clock in the morning. So the images now that I'm going to show you are in the Wilson area, where the visibility was down to zero, essentially, when the plume collapsed or when the fire arrived. And these stills are taken 1 hour after the fire hit the community. And there are a few things that I want you to look at, to really pay attention. First of all, I think you can see that there is you can see some of the clouds here, and there you can see the sun. There's some blue sky. There are patches. There's the flag. It's a little small, a little hard to see, but it is in there. And there is wind, but it's not at 50 or 60 miles an hour. Maybe it's at 20, 25, judging from the flag. What you see, if you look at all these areas here, you don't see significant ignitions. There's a little bit of smoldering stuff going on over here, and there is definitely a structure burning in the back. But it's not an environment where everything is on fire and all burning at the same time. Now we're going to fast forward in time, and we're going to look at 5.5 hours later in the Majestic area, high density structures, and between the fire front hitting and the time here for the second video footage, the stills. The destruction was again at a rate of 1 a minute, and that's what we have on Majestic, the lower part of Majestic. So we see a sea of foundations all along Majestic, and then great defensive action, successful defensive action, stopping the fire and saving those structures at the very bottom of Majestic. Putting again some numbers just to summarize what we have so far. Limited number of ignitions from the wildlands initially. They quickly start generating embers, which contribute significantly to the fire spread. We also have direct structure to structure with flame impingement in high density areas, and we also have structure to vegetation to structure. And these things result in that type of destruction over a course of less than 6 hours. And at the bottom of this figure of this table, we have the number of rigs in Mountain Shadows, net rigs in Mountain Shadows as a function of time. And this is, if you look at nationally, Chief Riley made a comment yesterday that there aren't too many cities that can provide this type of response, and we agree. It is important to plan this out. That's the main message here. To have everything predetermined to the extent that's possible, because we don't have, this table clearly summarizes in my mind that we don't have time to figure this out and lay all this out in real time. So, one house a minute. If you're standing and having a map on the hood of your truck and started to think about where you're going to put what division and who is available and who is on call today and who has a red card and who doesn't and how you want to pair people up, in the back of your mind you should be listening to this counter clicking at a rate of 1 house a minute. So, and it's more than that, because it's not 450 that ignited from the wildland, it's 50 nominally that ignited from the wildland initially. So for every home you save on the front end, there is this cascading effect, this multiplier effect that saves many more homes. So rapidly deploying, safely deploying, I cannot stress that enough, safely deploying, can make a very significant difference. But in order to safely deploy, there are a lot of things that need to come together, and we're going to talk about some of that through the presentation. One of which is that we need to really understand the exposure. We need to understand the exposure that we should expect. We need to understand the hazards. And we need to really understand that across different scales, and we're going to talk about that. But one of the points I want to make here is that exposure, when some people think of the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, and fire coming in from the wildlands, they think of this wall of flame, which may be the case as it was here initially. But after that, the exposure is very locale and time specific. Just to give you an example, this is the tower at the top of Wilson. This structure, 6305, is green. It was not destroyed. To its north and south, the structures are destroyed. This wind tower, we believe, this water tower provided a lee and some protection here. And the flow came around in both directions. What we see here is the effluent from that burning structure, all the debris, all the embers and all the burn missed 6305 by about 11 or 12 feet. So that's how that fire moves. It can be extremely specific and extremely local. So one structure can burn and the one next to it does not, because the embers reached it or didn't reach it, because that mulch pile brought that fire in close to one structure and it didn't close to the other. So we have to understand this WUI across many different scales. And I mentioned earlier that these fires are unique, and they're unique both in space, as I just mentioned, but also in time, as we've been looking at. So another way to say this is, let's look at both extremes. Let's look at the wildland fire side of things first here. Wildland fires can burn for days, weeks, occasionally even months. So there's plenty of time to organize the response, most of the time. In some cases, when you have a type 1 or a type 2 team that comes in, it might take them 12 or 24 hours to even get to the scene. Here, the whole event was over in 5.5 hours. We don't have the same time scale. If you go to the very other extreme, and many of you have that type of training on the urban side, you know that literally seconds count. A room can flash over in 120 to 180 seconds. Every second counts before you put water on the fire or take some type of action. And what we see is that the interface is not urban and is not wildland. So in WUI fires, what we say is minutes count. So those minutes can change the event. All right, we're going to talk now about defensive actions, and this is really a great story for all of the first responders in the room and all of the first responders that participated here. A couple of things before we get into the effectiveness. We know that at least 1/3 of structures/parcels were defended. We believe that the number is closer to half because we know that a significant number of vegetative fires we were not able to document because there were so many mulch and small vegetative fires that you all put out that we couldn't track. The structures we have, I would say that the structures, we probably have 95 to 98% of the actions documented and cross-correlated. So a lot of activity here in the first 5.5 hours, and we documented the first nominally 10 or 12 hours of the report. So let's look at some of the general statistics here. 344 homes destroyed. We identified 101 damaged structures through our technical discussions with you. I want to be very clear that it is highly likely that there were well over 101 damaged structures. We did not do a comprehensive damage assessment during our study for several reasons, one of which was that we started the study well after the fire scene had been cleaned up. And that is a thought I want you to keep in mind, because we're going to talk about collecting data in a few slides. One piece of data that typically does not get, well, let me rephrase it. We have not had this type of information for any other large fire. 154 structures, in this case, were defended to prevent structure ignition, and there was no damage to the structures. And we know which 154, and we know which one of you was there to defend those structures. That's amazing. That information doesn't get carried forward because it's so hard to collect. As Chief Riley mentioned yesterday, this is a very conservative number, and indeed it is. All the report in that context is we're trying to be as conservative as possible, in a sense that this 154, judging by what happened by the other structures, would have ignited many more. So this is really a great save, those 154 identified structures. It is possible that there were a few more that were not be able to collect, but 154 we definitely know. 94% of structures that were damaged, we know which one of you actually saved them. And that is commensurate with the other studies. We always have around 93, 95%. And that is important. That is important because, to me, this requires a paradigm shift in us looking at damaged homes. I would not be surprised if 94 was, the percentage was even higher, but we have confirmed 94. And what this tells me is that if we look at the fire scene after the fact and a structure is damaged, we should not assume that it self-extinguished. We should assume that it was defended and successfully defended. And that's important when evaluating mitigation, as we're going to see. Well over 245 parcels defended, as we discussed earlier. So we're going to go in now from big picture and zoom in. I'm going to talk about containing fire spread, and this is just one example. This is the area of Courtney, and the fire was boxed in very, very effectively. I will say that the effectiveness was directly tied to the wind abatement. When the wind was very strong, it was very, very difficult. But once that wind abated, your defensive actions really boxed in and contained that fire and prevented damage spread. And these yellow lines on the screen represent specific defensive actions. So just to give you a sense, we know who stopped it here, and for this particular case, we even have a picture, and that's the cover. That's the water stream between those two structures, the structure on the right here being saved. That's the level of resolution we're talking about here. We know who stopped it here, we know who stopped it here, 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 all the players down flying W, and on the other side preventing and putting out all the spots on the fences and the mulch and the vegetation, and all the way around. So this is really a great success story, and this is just one case. The same took place all the way from north to south in mountain shadows, where you guys boxed it in. So very, very effective. But this is great, this is fantastic. But this also has another implication, which in my mind is equally important, if not more critical. What we're seeing here is that your defensive actions are actually changing the event. They change the extent of losses, and they change the intensity of the event. And that is very, very important. This puts the wildland urban interface fires in a completely different regime or category than other disasters. We cannot change the intensity of an earthquake. We cannot change the intensity of a tornado or the intensity of a hurricane, but we can change the intensity of these WUI events. With a combination of mitigation pre-fire and during fire actions, we can actually alter the severity of these events. And this has significant implications. We don't have to assume these losses in the future. With the right planning and the right construction and the right response, safely, we can really change how these events develop. And I think that is a huge, huge finding. So let's now look into the specifics of defensive actions, because this is really a great story. And this is the first time we have data across such a large incident to be able to pull the statistics together. So 3 out of 4 times when you set out to extinguish a structure, you were very successful and you extinguished and saved the structure, which is fantastic. 4 out of 5 times you were equally successful in containing the fire to the structure of interest and preventing it from spreading to adjacent structures. But what I would like to do here now is zoom in and really look at this area right here. You notice that I didn't put extinguishment failures. I said unsuccessful extinguishments. And there is a reason, and we're going to now look into that reason. So if we take this and dive in a little more, what we see is that out of that 25%, 19%, while you didn't extinguish them successfully, you contained them successfully. So the number of structures that were unsuccessfully contained when you tried putting the fire out initially is only 6%, which is really fantastic. All right? So that's really great information. Before we go into looking at the containment effectiveness, I do want to talk a little bit about extinguishing and preventing ignition on structures. The data that we have up on the screen here is a table that summarizes the tools you all used when you defended the 154 structures that didn't experience any damage because of your contributions. And what we see here is that, yes, by far the largest tool usage was fire hose, but if you look, deck gun and structure prep are equal, and garden hoses are about the same. And that is very important. There were a lot of structures that were safely, there were a lot of structures that were successfully defended with hand tools and garden hoses. We saw that with some of the mutual aid teams that came with the Forest Service that didn't have big water, but we also saw it from some of the structural folks using some of those techniques. And that's important. That opens up potentially the repertoire, the tools available that can have implications in terms of what homeowners can do before an event, in terms of prepping structures, and with the right understanding of exposure, that can add significant value. Exposure is going to be the key here, really understanding where it is safe to do these types of operations, where you're going to need significant water. So let's look at the containment. Again, 21% we said contain unsuccessfully, not containment failures. And now we're going to zoom in and really look at this. So what we found is that 3 out of 4 times when we looked at those unsuccessful containments, these were in high fire exposure coupled with high structure density environments. All right? Another way to say it is 3 out of 4 times you essentially could not have contained that because the exposure was so high and the structures were so close. And for some of you who might not have been there, I just want to share in this area in Majestic, these colors, and these are all from the report, represent different structure densities. Right in here, we're looking at structure separation distances of 6 feet. That is the distance between my fingertips. So when you have that type of environment with multiple structures burning at the same time, you physically, for all intents and purposes, cannot abstract, cannot remove that heat fast enough to save those structures. What does this mean? It means several things. Those are not failures, all right? But more importantly, in my mind, it means that we cannot afford to have fire go into these communities. Because once it goes in and that fire gets deep-seated, with those exposures, it's essentially quasi-impossible to stop. And the losses then become very, very significant. So we need a paradigm shift. We need to think about how to prevent the fire from getting into those communities in the first place. So examples of that type of thought process could be, green spaces over here, different land use, for new communities, potentially different housing densities. There are all sorts of things that we should start discussing. But the main point here is we don't want that fire to get in there. And this was not an environment, as we'll see later on, where you could have been in there beforehand because of the very high exposures that were experienced there initially from the wildland fire front. So structural density significantly impacted containment activities. And this again, to summarize the rapid evolution, and that structure to structure involves multiple mechanisms. It's not just direct flame impingement like we saw in that high density. I'm going to jump back for just 1 second here because on Majestic there is one more thing I want to point out when we're talking about structure to structure. In the report, we have documented how the fire actually hopscotched down Majestic from embers. And that's another one of the contributions of structure to structure, not contributions, mechanisms for structure to structure fire spread. All right, so so far I think we have made the case that in order to look at first responder effectiveness and tactics and all that we've discussed so far, you really need the timeline, you need the defensive actions, and you need to understand the local exposure. If you don't collect all of this information, you can really, there is the potential to really get in trouble with interpreting the fire scene. So really, if we're going to go and try and understand these events, we have to do a comprehensive analysis. Something like this, unfortunately, takes 2 to 3 years to do and a lot of hours, but that is giving us data that is reliable and cross-correlated and checked, and that we can then take forward. So I want to talk a little bit now about data collection, because that's kind of where we're heading. I want to say that when you read the report, and I encourage you to all read it, you might find that you gave us one statement, and in the report we have a different statement in there. It wouldn't be a statement, it would be, in one of the 35 or 40 maps that we have in the report. You might say, oh, well, no, I told them that this wasn't burning. What we have found is that the observations we got are very spatially and temporally limited. And let me give you one example. You might have one first responder that drives on Flying W and looks at the structure and says, this home wasn't burning at 8 o'clock. We have the AVL, we know when we're driving by, we know it wasn't burning. We have another first responder, call him first responder B, who says, that house at 8 o'clock was burning. And we have their AVL, and they were there. What happens is first responder A saw the west side of the house, first responder B saw the east side of the house was burning on the east side on the deck, it wasn't visible from the west side. The data that we have, we're able to cross-correlate and bin and clean up, and that's why it took a year to clean up the data, because there were so many of these statements which are not wrong, they just have to be provided with the appropriate context. Another example is Manning Way. Many of you in this room might have put water on Manning Way on 1605. There were multiple reignitions of that structure. So at any one time, if you drove by, the structure could have been non-burning, destroyed, on fire, reignited. So you have to really understand what type of data you are receiving and really put it in context. And all of that takes a lot of time. So before we move on, I will say that as part of this linking of defensive actions to try and understand the event, we cross-referenced the damage information with ground-based damage information. So when a first responder told us, yeah, this deck was on fire and we put it out, we have imagery that confirmed that the deck was burned and the suppression action took place. So all that was cross-correlated. And that's great. We found that really that the methodology works. Now there's a word of caution. Unfortunately, you cannot shortchange the methodology. And I'll give you just one of many, many examples. We could have stopped at technical discussion 100. We could have stopped at technical discussion 150. 150 is a lot of technical discussions. But we wanted to see it all the way through and follow all the, defensive action leads. And I'll take a step back here just to provide a context for the extent of the work that was involved here. So, when we started this effort, we didn't have a list of all the apparatus that were involved. So we had to track down, and we ended up tracking down probably 120 plus rigs to find out the 101 that were in mountain shadows at the time of interest. So a lot of work, but we could have stopped before 220, but we didn't. And this is one example why it's so necessary to do this very methodically and all the way. We had done, and I'm not exaggerating, we had done 150 technical discussions. And for the first 150 technical discussions, not a single first responder had been in this area of Majestic where those 4 homes were left standing. All right? So if we had stopped that report right there, those 4 homes would have been miracle homes. Homes are standing, and we could come up and say, well, yeah, they were standing because look, there wasn't a pile of firewood. They were standing because they didn't have a wooden deck. You could make anything you wanted. Discussion 151, we found the team that was there all night defending those 4 structures. So unfortunately, that's what it takes. If you really want to understand what happened, you have to see it all the way through. It is now important to put in perspective what can be done when you only have 2 or 3 days during or right after the incident. And what we're saying here is that there is an opportunity. There is really a unique opportunity that's only available for a short period of time after the incident, and that is to collect damage information. Not damage by driving by, damage by walking around every structure, because a lot of the damage is not visible from the street. But if we can make this happen, if we can start collecting reliable damage information across the nation from multiple WUI incidents, we can start getting a sense for the ignition vulnerabilities. We can start understanding which parts of the structure are catching. And now we can focus our efforts on creating better test methods that will go into building code standards and product development to help us with those vulnerabilities. That's a great opportunity to enable this to happen. Because with 2 or 3 or 5 days after the event, you cannot pull together this type of information to really understand what happened. It's just not possible. So that's an opportunity we feel that is out there and could add value. So now let's look at hazards. We've talked about hazards, we've talked about exposure. So let's look at hazards. Hazards really span multiple scales in a community. And we have to understand them across those multiple scales in order to pre-plan safely. That's very, very important. And there is information out there, but there is a lot more work that needs to be done to help us really quantify those hazards. So around communities, you can think of topographic features that line up with prevailing winds, with high fuel loads. Those are areas that can be of significant concern. At the community level, we talked about higher density structures. And then at the parcel level, you can think of decks, combustible decks, fences, roofs, vegetative fuel loading. And these are some of the hazards we have identified at a parcel level. Decks, fences, railroad ties, which can burn for a long time, many days after, they can trap the heat. Secondary buildings, those are important because in many hazard assessment and mitigation methodologies. They're not even present, and we have seen this over and over in California, Texas, and here. Secondary buildings, sheds, catching on fire and moving the fire to the primary structure. These really need to be addressed, particularly if we build structures to some standards and we don't build the sheds to the same standards. And those are the weak links that then carry the fire and cause the problems. Reentrant corners where embers can accumulate, and readily ignitable roof coverings. Those are some of the hazards that we have seen across the different fires. Now I'd like to talk about a defensible space. The idea with the defensible space is that you go a certain distance out from your structure, whether it is 30 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet, and you treat the fuels. And when we say you treat the fuels, the focus is really on vegetative fuels, thinning, pruning, and the like. And this idea by itself, in a setting where you have a lot of land, has the potential to add value. Less fuel is definitely better. There's one caveat that frequently gets missed even in a more rural setting. We're not going to talk about high density quite yet. And we have seen this both in Texas and in California, in communities where we don't actually have fuel removal, but we have fuel displacement. So you take your firewood, you take it away from your house, and you put it next to your neighbor's house. Or if you're lucky, you don't put it next to your neighbor's house, but you put it next to the property line. And what this does is your neighbor does the same, and now we have this nice high density fuel path through the community that the fire really loves and carries and spreads from parcel to parcel. So we want to really be thinking about fuel removal, not fuel displacement. But there are a couple of issues that we have identified with defensible space here that are well beyond that parcel level idea. And one of them is that in many cases the concept of defensible space is not really applicable. This is an example right here. The high density area of Majestic. Yeah, you can move your firewood if you have where to put it on your very small parcel, or you can remove your firewood completely, which is great, but you cannot move your neighbor's house, which is thousands of pounds of combustible fuel that's only 6 feet away. So that's where instead of defensible space, or maybe to phrase it, in addition to defensible space, we really need to expand and think about this idea of not having the fire in that community, because you can not remove that fuel effectively in that high density area. The other idea which I briefly mentioned earlier is if you only go 100 feet out, what you might miss is you might miss all that vegetative fuel load and this dangerous topographical feature that's perfectly lined up with your community and the prevailing winds, which bring this very severe assault to the neighborhood. And this is why in Majestic it was not safe to stay here. One of the scouting teams on the way back parked their vehicle right here, and they had their hoods on inside the truck, and the trim was melting inside the truck from the exposure from the wildlands. And that is not captured in the defensible space right now, and that's a huge issue that we have identified. All right. So situational awareness and identifying hazards, these are all opportunities, opportunities to develop, things to think about and grow over time. In order to deploy rapidly, we're going to need a lot of information. If you think of this WUI event here, the Waldo, and you contrast it to a high-rise fire. When you show up, typically at a high-rise fire, you're going to know a lot about the fire before you even get there. You're going to get it either on your rig, or you're going to get it from the panel as soon as you walk in the front door. That analogy doesn't apply here. Here we had to wait for things to clear before the scouts could go in safely and assess the situation. There are opportunities for technology to help bridge that gap and enable enhanced situational awareness, and potentially more rapid and safe deployment. So these are all things that we are looking down the future to help develop. The idea of mapping exposure, I think, is absolutely critical. As we discussed, we have hazards spanning different scales, but really understanding where the high hazards are in a trackable, repeatable, quantifiable way is very important. And that's very important because think of it in this way. If Colorado Springs develops a hazard map and one of the other cities up or down the Front Range develops another hazard map, and they don't use the same criteria, when mutual aid happens and you respond, you're not going to be interpreting the same scene the same way. So we need standardized ways to assess and map those hazards. So I think that's all very important. And when we talk about hazards, we really need to be looking across the different scales we talked about earlier. Landscape, community, neighborhood, parcel. And we have to look at this mapping in the context of fuels, topography, and local weather, because the weather is a key, and when we say weather, it's really wind. It really drives these events, and we have seen this all over. We're going to be wrapping up here. I cannot stress this enough. In order to rapidly deploy, you have to understand exposure. Exposure is really the key to safe deployments and potentially more rapid deployments. And one of the things that I really think is really critical here to emphasize is that when we start talking about pre-planning, it's going to be very important to practice. To practice with mutual aid, work out all the kinks, because you don't have time in real time to work out the kinks. To sum it up, before we go into the summary slides here, the last smoke inhalation has been identified as a key issue in the WUI by first responders and for first responders. And I will say that a couple of weeks ago, the Fallen Firefighters Foundation had a research meeting in DC with probably a couple of hundred folks. A number were present from Colorado Springs down there. And one of the issues that was brought to the forefront is exactly that, smoke inhalation and PPE for the WUI. So that's gaining national attention, and that is great news. Improving firefighter safety, mapping the hazards, I think is going to be absolutely essential, and pre-planning, because that will remove some of the uncertainties associated with these events. So we have 2 slides now to wrap it up. In summary, the fires in the wildland urban interface are very different. They're different in time, they're different in space, and the ignition rates require for us to think about them in a completely different way. All the actions you took were extremely effective in terms of boxing in the fire, containing the fire, extinguishing structures that were burning, and also preventing structures from igniting. We saw that the event, in this case, the wildland fire, did not destroy all 450 homes. It started, relatively speaking, small and very rapidly grew. Pre-planning is essential because we don't have time during the event to lay this out, figure out the mutual aid, figure out the task forces, all of these things. However, I will stress that in order to do it safely, a lot of work needs to be done to understand the hazards, to understand how to safely deploy, where to safely deploy, and all of that. The defensible space concepts have significant limitations in the WUI. Burning of primary structures, density of structures, embers, which are not being currently adequately addressed, and the hazards outside the home ignition zone. Lastly, we feel that there's a great opportunity for damage assessment right after the fire to really focus on damage to enable us to start getting across the nation a better understanding of those ignition vulnerabilities of the structures in the WUI. With that, I want to thank you, and I'm going to open it up for questions.
Okay, so Chief Dalton and I will be your all's Vanna White, and we have the microphones. So because we're taping this and broadcasting it, we want to make sure the questions are heard when Alex gives an answer. So anybody that has a question, please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you.
So you can try to.
I had one texted into me. What types of technology are you talking about for detecting the heat rates and stuff like that? Are you advocating that we send more scouts up? Or is there technology that will make it safer for us to be able to get that information without having people up in the area?
That's a great question. The question is about situational awareness and the technologies used. We are not tied to a particular technology, and we're not advocating one technology. All we're saying is that technology can add value over here. The same way a temperature sensor adds value when you show up to a building fire and you know what to expect, or you have more information. The same way technology can be used here. And just to give a few examples, again, we're not proposing one technology over another, but there can be obscuration devices that give you a sense of the visibility. There can be heat sensors that give you a heat signature or temperature or heat flux. These devices can be fixed. They can be dropped in situ before the front arrives. They can be manned systems, or they can be unmanned systems, aerial or ground-based. So there are a lot of opportunities out there to help you get a better sense for what is going on rapidly. And I think we can learn a lot from looking at how we have done it in buildings, and, no pun intended, think outside the box and see how we can adapt some of these ideas. But there are also more opportunities, particularly with unmanned vehicles, not necessarily flying, but there are a lot of opportunities. And I'm saying not necessarily flying because not only there are logistical issues in coordinating during the event, as we have seen in California and many other places, but also because in most cases these WUI fires occur during high winds, and those can be very problematic for small unmanned vehicles. I'm not saying we should exclude them, but we shouldn't just focus on that. One question right here.
So you talk about how the spacing between the structures contributed to the ignition of the cascade ignition. Did you get any data or any feeling for what the mean structure distance might need to be to prevent that kind of structure ignition?
That's a great question. I'm going to take a step back and tell you about some work we did at NIST to put it in perspective, and then get back to the case study. About 10 years ago, because we saw the high density issue across the US as really an emerging issue, not in the context of WUI, but we kept hearing from fire departments that they have these situations where by the time they can stop it, they have lost 2 or 3 or 4 structures because of the high density. So we did a couple of experiments. We built 2 two-story facades, and we set them apart 6 feet. And behind one of the 2-story facades, we built a living room, fully furnished, and we lit the sofa on fire. The first experiment was with unrestricted construction, and there was vinyl siding for our experiments. The sofa ignited. Within less than 3 minutes, the room flashed, the window broke, fire came out the window. 80 seconds later, your neighbor's house was on fire, 80. We then proceeded to do the same experiment, but we added a fire-resistant layer between the OSB and the vinyl. We had a window on the target wall, but it was staggered, so the fire wouldn't come out one window and go into the other window. We intentionally didn't want that to happen. We're not saying it couldn't happen in real life. By adding that fire-resistant layer, we delayed the fire spread. We delayed it to the point where in our particular setting it didn't occur. The fuel got all used up in the room. But in a real life scenario, it would be delayed. So the introduction of a fire resistant barrier, and some of the more recent codes have that in them, significantly enhances fire spread, significantly limits fire spread and enhances the building's performance. So that's the great news. What we saw here is we saw a lot of failures, right? Structure to structure to structure to structure. It is very difficult from these investigations to come up with success. It is these types of investigations can enable us to identify the failures. But because the environment is not controlled, you cannot backtrack the success. So we can look at it, and we have in the report several cases where we saw failures, and you can look at the distances in the housing. But the success has to come from a very controlled series of experiments to enable us to understand exactly what we're buying, because there is a big difference between delaying the ignition and stopping the ignition. You can put a fire-resistant barrier like it's required in some codes, and then have exposed eaves, and the fire just gets the eaves on fire. And or you can have enclosed eaves, and the embers get in the attic. So, but it's good to take it all apart and understand what is the weakest link and what value added comes from the different solutions. And the fire-resistant barrier can have significant impact, because what it does is it has the potential to slow the evolution down, and under certain conditions may enable first responders to actually stop it. Great question. Any other questions?
Yeah, Greg Toll, Boulder Fire. I'm assuming that most of these neighborhoods and communities have been rebuilt or on the process of being rebuilt. Do you know if anything has changed, the plot sizes, the density, the construction materials?
I'm going to let Fire Marshal Lacey talk to that.
A similar question was asked yesterday, and I don't think I did that really justice. So the homes in the area that were impacted ranged anywhere from construction in the early 70s up to current. Okay, as you moved up the hill where the fire first bumped into Mountain Shadows, as Alex spoke to, those were the newest homes. And when we got down into the conflagration areas, those were the older homes, obviously very dense, not built according to approved development plans, those kind of things. Things we all see as jurisdictional folks in our communities. As a result of the fire, we worked with the HBA and the entire community, the victims of the fire. And we passed an ordinance locally that provided much more restrictive and aggressive ignition resistance. For those out there that are code nerds, we've got to be careful with fire resistive and non-combustible terms. Those are very specific. We used ignition resistant, and we tailored that very specifically to what we are doing here in Colorado Springs. And so we hardened the structure both with siding, so you can no longer build with combustible siding. It has to be cementitious or stucco or brick, those kind of surfaces. Also sealing up weeps where embers can penetrate. So we took very aggressive steps, but very simple steps in working with the building community and the HBA to provide a much higher degree of ignition resistance. But keep in mind, the expectation from our community with a lot of discussion was not that those would necessarily stand on their own, as would a non-combustible or a fire-resistive structure. But it's coupled with the response of our crews, as Alex has spoken to. If we can intercede quickly and saturate those kind of events with increased hardening or ignition resistance of the structures, we believe we are going to far better deal with that event. And so all of the reconstructed homes and any new homes will be built to that standard, if that addresses your question.
But the density is the same.
The density has improved in certain places and been exacerbated in others because we built two-story where there were one-story. So the political process through development review and all of those things that happen with people who own their own property There have been dynamic changes in there, but for the most part, it is probably less dense than what it was, but not necessarily by a whole lot.
What about roofing material, Brad?
Roofing material was addressed back in 2002, right after the Hayman fire. The city of Colorado Springs citywide embarked on a Class A roofing ordinance. So any roofing replacement over 25%, and obviously any new roofing, has to be a Class A roof. So we addressed that back in the early 2000s.
What about what was existing in Mount Shadows area?
A huge mix, and Alex can speak a little bit more with some of the things on the saves that they have here were some existing wood shakes that had not been replaced and didn't need to be replaced, because the way the ordinance is, it's you can repair certain small pieces, but you don't have to replace until the whole thing's got to go, or above that 25%. So we had a hodgepodge of asphalt, of metal, of clay, and then of wood shake.
Were any of the structures protected by P2904 or 13D sprinkler systems, or do we know?
There were no single-family dwellings that were protected by sprinkler systems that I recall up there, and they did not have any impact or effect because of that.
I would like to add to what Fire Marshal Lacey said. Just not to beat a dead horse, but I think it is very important in looking forward and planning for rapid deployment. I think it is absolutely critical to make sure we understand what exposures to expect so that we don't get people in dangerous situations. And just to show you, in the plot with the rigs, I'll go back real quick. Okay. In this plot, we have the first firefront arrives, first evacuation. And you saw the blue sky. And there was an opportunity, we feel, in this particular event, we're not saying it's going to be in every event, to potentially deploy resources in some safe environments and take care of some of those ignitions, potentially. However, I will say that there was a second evacuation that took place, and that was because so many structures got involved that locally the visibility got so bad that there was concern that there was an entire new front coming. And in fact there was. It was just a front from structures, not a front from vegetation. So we really need to understand the dynamics of this very well to plan for those rapid deployments. I think it's absolutely critical. It has tremendous potential in the right conditions, but I think mapping those hazards in these communities, really enabling first responders to understand what to expect in different conditions, along with advances in understanding fire behavior in the wildlands and predicting fire behavior in the wildlands, I think can all go together with a built environment to help reduce the losses. Any other questions? Any texts? Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you all very much for coming. There are CDs you can pick up on the way out that have the report, and also have a shorter version of this presentation that we gave to the White House a couple of weeks ago. So feel free to take. Thank you.